For nearly 50 years, no enemy could kill Stefano Magaddino. A bomb missed him and killed his sister. A grenade came through his window and never went off. The FBI bugged his funeral home for 3 straight years and couldn't put him in jail. The boss of the Buffalo Mafia survived everything the outside world threw at him, and then his own people decided they'd had enough. If stories like this are your thing, click the like button and let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Let's get into it. Stefano Magaddino was born on October 10, 1891, in Castellammare del Golfo, a coastal town in Sicily. Both of his grandfathers had led factions of the Sicilian Mafia, so he grew up in a world where power and blood were tied together from the start. His father, Giovanni, was closely related to the family of Joseph Bonanno, the future boss of the Bonanno crime family in New York. The two boys would stay connected for the rest of their lives, through blood and through business. In the early 1900s, the Magaddino clan entered a blood feud with the Buccellato family, led by Felice Buccellato. Two of Bonanno's uncles, Stefano and Giuseppe, were killed. Their younger brother Salvatore, Joseph Bonanno's father, answered with revenge, killing members of the Buccellato clan. Stefano was only 11 when his family decided Sicily had become too dangerous. In 1902, he arrived in New York as a member of a network that was already waiting for him. The clan from Castellammare del Golfo took him in, and young Magaddino stepped directly into its power structure. What he witnessed as a child, feuds, betrayals, calculated killings, would shape every decision he made for the next 70 years. By the 1910s, Magaddino had become a trusted figure inside the Castellammarese clan in New York City. The organization would later be tied to a string of unsolved murders across the country, a network investigators nicknamed the Good Killers. In March 1917, Magaddino orchestrated the murder of Buccellato, the same Detroit gangster whose family had feuded with his own back in Sicily. The killing was payback carried out years after the blood feud had crossed the ocean with him. The case that finally caught up with him began in August 1921. A barber named Bartolo Fontana walked into a New York police station and confessed to murdering Camillo Caiozzo weeks earlier in Avon, New Jersey. Fontana said the Good Killers had ordered the hit in retaliation for Caiozzo's role in the 1916 murder of Magaddino's brother Pietro back in Sicily. Fontana was terrified. He believed the men who ordered him to kill would eventually silence him too, so he made a deal with police and agreed to help set a trap. The plan brought Magaddino into the open. He arranged to meet Fontana at Grand Central Station, carrying $30 to help him disappear. The moment the money changed hands, undercover officers moved in and arrested him. 4 other men connected to the murder were picked up shortly after, including Vito Bonventre. Under questioning, Fontana went further, tying the Good Killers to a series of other murders, and then the case simply fell apart. New Jersey prosecutors declined to pursue conspiracy charges, and despite testimony from the officers who ran the sting, the charges against Magaddino were dropped. He walked free. But New York City no longer felt safe. Magaddino needed somewhere to disappear, far from the clans, the feuds, and the men who knew his name. He was heading for Buffalo. Buffalo in 1922 had an underworld problem of its own. The local crime family had been founded a decade earlier by Joseph DiCarlo and his underboss Angelo Palmieri, known on the streets as Buffalo Bill. DiCarlo's death that year left the family without a clear leader, and Palmieri reached out to fill the gap. He didn't look far. Magaddino had just fled New York City with a murder charge behind him and no future left on the Castellammarese clan's home turf. Palmieri invited him to take over. For a man running from a dropped charge and a network that suddenly felt too small for him, the timing was perfect. Magaddino accepted, and by the end of 1922, he was boss of the Buffalo crime family. He was 31. Nobody outside a small circle of criminals had ever heard his name, and that was about to become his greatest advantage. Once he controlled Buffalo, Magaddino needed something the New York clans never bothered with: a legitimate face. He found it in an unlikely business. In Niagara Falls, he opened the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, a funeral home that would carry his name for the next 5 decades. On paper, he was a mortician, a businessman who buried the dead, attended church, and paid his taxes. The funeral home gave him something priceless, a reason to move cash, meet visitors at odd hours, and keep a low profile without raising questions. It also gave him his nickname. Associates and rivals alike started calling him the Undertaker, a name that stuck for the rest of his life and fit him in more ways than one. Around the same period, Magaddino picked up a consigliere who became central to his operation, John C. Montana. Montana was a former Buffalo City councilman with real standing in the community, a businessman respected by people who had no idea what he was connected to. Having Montana beside him gave Magaddino something few mafia bosses had: a direct line into legitimate Buffalo politics and business. Between the funeral chapel and Montana's respectability, Magaddino had built the foundation of something most bosses never figured out. He could operate 2 lives at once and keep them from ever touching in public. By the mid-1930s, Magaddino had built real power in Buffalo. Power like that always draws enemies, and in May 1936, those enemies came for him. He was living on Whitney Avenue in Niagara Falls, next door to his sister, Arcangela Longo, her husband Nicholas, and their 3 daughters. In the early hours of May 19th, someone threw an explosive device into the Longo home. The blast tore through the house, ripping away walls and hurling furniture through the air. It was powerful enough to damage Magaddino's home next door and a 3rd house belonging to a neighbor. Arcangela was thrown from her feet and engulfed in flame. She died in the hospital that afternoon. Her 3 daughters, Josephine, Rose, and Lena, were injured, but survived. Nicholas Longo wasn't even in the city that night. He was in New York on business, which left investigators puzzled. If the bomb was meant for him, why strike while he was hundreds of miles away, and why leave his wife and children to pay the price? The local press ran 3 theories: a bookmaker's war, a beer distributor's dispute, or a personal grudge against Longo. None of them stuck. Police never identified a suspect, and the case went cold. The truth came out in 1963 when former mobster Joseph Valachi testified before a Senate subcommittee. Valachi said the real target had never been Longo at all. It was Magaddino. A rival faction inside a Cosa Nostra power struggle had marked every man from Castellammare del Golfo for death, and Magaddino was on that list simply because of where he was born. The bomb missed him. It killed his sister instead. Whoever planted that bomb was trying to erase an entire bloodline over a hometown rivalry, and it's Magaddino's own sister who paid for it. While Prohibition gripped the United States, Niagara Falls sat on top of an opportunity most bosses could only dream of: a border. Magaddino understood exactly what that meant. The Niagara River separated Canada from New York State by a short, foggy crossing. On the other side sat a steady supply of Canadian whiskey and wine, completely legal to produce and sell in Ontario. All Magaddino needed was a way to move it across the water. His men smuggled liquor by truck, by fishing boat, and according to some accounts, hidden inside coffins from his own funeral home. The shipments fed speakeasies across Buffalo and fueled Niagara Falls' rowdy, honky-tonk nightlife. The profits were enormous. By the early 1930s, his bootlegging operation was generating what would amount to tens of millions of dollars today. All of it untaxed and nearly impossible to trace. His territory grew with the money, eventually stretching across Buffalo, Rochester, and Utica in New York, west into Youngstown, Ohio, and north across the border into Fort Erie, Toronto, and as far as Montreal. That geography gave him something most bosses never had: distance from the constant infighting among the New York City families. Magaddino built his empire in a corner of the map nobody else was fighting over, and that made him nearly impossible to challenge. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Magaddino lost his biggest source of income overnight. Most criminal operations built entirely on bootlegging collapsed with it. Magaddino's didn't. He simply redirected the machine he'd already built. Loan sharking became a steady source of income, lending money at crushing interest rates to people with nowhere else to turn. Illegal gambling spread across his territory, along with extortion rackets that squeezed local businesses for protection money. Labor racketeering gave him a foothold inside entire industries, controlling unions and skimming profits from workers who had no idea the man behind their paycheck ran a crime family. And then there were the legitimate businesses that made all of it easier. Magaddino owned linen supply companies serving hotels across the region, along with taxicab companies and other service businesses that gave his operation a clean, everyday cover. By the end of the 1930s, Magaddino wasn't just running a bootlegging ring anymore. He was running a diversified criminal economy, built to survive any single source of income drying up. What strikes me most about this stretch of his life is how little of it depended on luck. Other bosses got rich fast during Prohibition, had no plan for what came after, and most didn't survive the transition. Magaddino did because he never treated bootlegging as the business. He treated it as one revenue stream inside something bigger, and that's a level of long-term thinking you rarely see from men running crews in the 1920s. The Whitney Avenue bombing also tells you something important about how he operated afterward. He didn't retaliate publicly, he didn't make noise, he absorbed it and kept building. That's cold, and it's also exactly why he lasted 50 years while flashier bosses lasted 5. The tragedy is that his sister paid the price for a rivalry that had nothing to do with her, and Magaddino's response wasn't justice, it was silence. To me, that silence is the real origin of everything he became. A boss who understood early that staying invisible mattered more than getting even. By the mid-1930s, the American Mafia was no longer a collection of scattered, feuding clans. Charles Lucky Luciano had helped organize the country's crime families into the Commission, a national body created to settle disputes, coordinate major decisions, and prevent the bloody wars that had defined the previous decade. Magaddino earned a seat as a charter member, and it wasn't symbolic. Buffalo sat in a strange position, close enough to matter but far enough from New York City to stay out of the rivalries between the 5 families. That distance made Magaddino a useful, neutral voice, and it meant he attended some of the most important underworld gatherings of the era. In 1946, he traveled to the Havana Conference, a meeting of top mob bosses held in Cuba under the cover of a Frank Sinatra concert. The gathering brought together the most powerful men in American organized crime to discuss the future of the national syndicate. His presence at Havana confirmed what his own family already knew. He was no longer a regional boss running liquor across a river. He was one of the men shaping decisions for the entire American Mafia, a position he would hold longer than almost anyone else in its history. 22 years after Whitney Avenue, someone came for Magaddino again. By 1958, he was living in Lewiston, New York, in a quiet house on Dana Drive. One evening, someone threw a hand grenade through the kitchen window while he and his wife sat in the living room. The blast should have ended his life right there, it didn't go off. Police described the grenade as a dummy type used for training, containing no real explosive. Whether it failed by accident or was never meant to detonate is something investigators never settled. Suspicions circled back to the previous year. Some believe the attack was retaliation from mobsters furious over a disastrous meeting Magaddino himself had organized, one that had just exposed the entire mafia to the public eye and brought federal attention down on every family involved. That meeting was APALACHIN, and it's where the real unraveling begins. On November 14th, 1957, at Magaddino's own insistence, commission bosses from across the country gathered in a small town in upstate New York called Apalachin. The meeting was meant to resolve pressing business, most urgently the recent killing of New York boss Albert Anastasia, which had left the underworld's power balance dangerously unsettled. Magaddino picked the location himself. He believed rural Appalachin was the perfect cover, a sleepy hamlet where, in his words, the local police were simple farmers with no understanding of organized crime. He was wrong. The gathering took place at the home of Joseph Barbara, a Pittston, Pennsylvania mob boss. But dozens of limousines and men in expensive suits pulling into a small farm town does not go unnoticed. and the New York State Police noticed immediately. They raided the property, and what followed became one of the most consequential law enforcement actions in American mafia history. Magaddino escaped through the woods in his suit, tracking mud for miles to avoid capture. He got away. John C. Montana, his own consigliere and the respected former city councilman, was not so lucky. His arrest at Apalachin destroyed the mainstream image he had spent his whole life constructing. For law enforcement, Apalachin changed everything. Before the raid, the FBI had spent years publicly denying that a national crime syndicate even existed. After it, that denial was impossible. The Bureau made organized crime a primary target, and Magaddino, the man who chose the location, had unintentionally handed federal agents the proof they needed to justify years of investigation. He spent 35 years staying invisible, and the one meeting he personally organized is the exact event that made the mafia impossible to ignore. The Kennedy administration made organized crime a national priority, and Magaddino became a direct target. Beginning in June 1962, federal agents planted listening devices inside the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, the same funeral home that had given him cover for nearly 4 decades. The wiretaps ran for 3 years and generated an almost unbelievable 76,000 pages of transcripts and notes. The surveillance captured Magaddino discussing business, family matters, and rivals in his own words, material investigators had spent decades chasing. Courts would later rule the wiretaps illegal, but by then the damage had been done. The recordings also revealed something more personal, his hatred for the Kennedy family. Agents picked up Magaddino venting that they should kill the whole Kennedy family, a comment that captured how deeply the federal crackdown had gotten under his skin. A man who avoided newspapers and courtrooms for 40 years just had every private conversation in his own building recorded by the government, and there was nothing he could do about it. In 1963, Joseph Bonanno, Magaddino's own cousin and longtime ally, made a decision that shattered the fragile peace of the commission. Bonanno began plotting to assassinate Magaddino along with several other rival bosses, including Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and Frank De Simone. His ambition was enormous. He wanted to eliminate his rivals and take control of the entire commission, installing Profatti family boss, Joseph Magliocco, as his right-hand man. Magliocco agreed, still bitter over having been denied a commission seat years earlier. Magliocco was given the job of arranging the killings of Lucchese and Gambino, and he handed that contract to one of his top hitmen, Joseph Colombo. But Colombo saw an opportunity of his own. Instead of carrying out the hit, he went straight to the intended targets and exposed the plot. The other bosses moved quickly. They knew how close Bonanno and Magliocco were and how their families were tied through marriage. The commission soon concluded that Bonanno was the true architect of the plan. Both men were summoned to explain themselves. Bonanno, fearing for his life, fled to Canada, leaving Magliocco alone to face judgment. The story didn't end there. In October 1964, Bonanno returned to Manhattan, planning to testify before a grand jury. The night before his scheduled appearance, after dinner with his lawyers, he was kidnapped as he entered an apartment building on Park Avenue. The men responsible were allegedly working for Magaddino himself. Blood relatives, decades of alliance, and a shared homeland hadn't stopped Bonanno from targeting Magaddino for assassination. And it didn't stop Magaddino from allegedly having his own cousin kidnapped off a Manhattan street a year later. This was Blood, a cousin he'd known his entire life, and Magaddino's response wasn't to talk it out at a commission meeting, it was to make him disappear. By the 1960s, FBI agents had spent years building a presence in Buffalo, watching Magaddino's operation from every angle. In 1967, that patience paid off. In a scene that echoed the disaster a decade earlier, police raided an illegal gambling hall hidden in the basement of Panaro's Snowball Lounge. Almost every member of the family was swept up in the arrests, everyone except Magaddino himself and his son Peter. The press nicknamed the raid Little Apalachin, a fitting sequel to the meeting that had made national headlines a decade before. Later that year, the FBI picked up a low-level thug named Pasquale Calabrese on burglary charges. The Magaddino leadership made a costly mistake. They ignored his situation, leaving him to face the charges alone with no support from the family he'd worked for. Calabrese turned on them. He told investigators he had committed the burglaries on direct orders from underboss Federico Randaccio and capo Pat Nattarelli. On December 11, 1967, both men were convicted and sentenced to 20 years each, a devastating blow to Magaddino's command structure. The family that had operated in near-total secrecy for decades was now losing its own soldiers to informants, one after another. Here's what I think really mattered in this stretch of his life. Magaddino spent his career building loyalty through fear and distance. But fear only works as long as people believe the organization has their back. The moment Randaccio and Nattarelli went down because Calabrese had been abandoned, that unspoken contract broke. Bonanno's Betrayal tells a similar story from a different angle. When a boss starts ordering hits on men he's related to by blood and gets a kidnapping ordered against him in return, the whole structure of trust the commission was built on stops meaning anything. APALACHIN exposed the Mafia to the public. Little APALACHIN and the Bonanno War exposed something worse to the men inside it, that loyalty in this world was conditional, and Magaddino's own family was starting to feel that conditionality firsthand. He survived every external threat, federal wiretaps, grenades, rival hits, but I don't think he ever fully accounted for what happens when the people closest to him stop trusting the man at the top. By the late 1960s, the Magaddino family had turned to burglary as another source of income, running a ring controlled by John C. Sacco with three key men underneath him, Russell DeCicco, Gregory Parnes, and Luis Mavrakis. They didn't know the FBI was already circling. An informant had stepped forward, Gregory's own brother, Paul Parnes, feeding federal agents information about the ring. Paul revealed that Sacco had connections reaching Russell Bufalino, boss of the Pittston crime family. In April 1968, the two began working together, starting with a plan to sell 60 stolen color television sets. Thanks to Paul's tip, the FBI recovered every set before the deal could go through. Then the ring set its sights on something far more valuable: the private art collection of T. Edward Hanley. Hanley was a wealthy Pennsylvania collector who had spent decades acquiring rare books and fine art. His collection was well known in art circles and, unfortunately, just as well known to the men planning the burglary. On August 21, 1968, DeCicco and Mavrakis broke into Hanley's home while he slept upstairs in poor health. They forced their way into his gallery and walked out with 14 framed paintings and 2 bronze statues, including works by Goya, Rodin, and Degas. The 2 most valuable pieces were Picasso's Au Moulin Rouge, worth $500,000 at the time, and Cézanne's Portrait of Vallier, valued at $450,000. The total loss came to nearly $1.4 million, an almost unheard-of figure for a single burglary in 1968. The thieves had pulled off one of the largest art heists in American history. What they hadn't accounted for was the woman about to come home and find out what they'd done. Tulla Hanley returned from a business trip the day after the burglary and immediately took charge. She had met her husband decades earlier at a Buffalo club where she worked as a belly dancer, and he had divorced his first wife to marry her. By 1968, she was in her 70s, but nothing about her had softened with age. She went straight to the press, publicly offering a reward for the painting's safe return, no questions asked, and insisting the theft had been the work of local amateurs. A New York State police captain quietly disagreed, telling a reporter the burglary had, in his words, a definite Cosa Nostra flavor. While Tulla worked the media, the FBI worked the case. An undercover agent posed as a corrupt art dealer and convinced DeCicco he could move the paintings. DeCicco took the bait completely. On August 29th, he and his partners drove toward Bradford, Pennsylvania to retrieve the artwork, unaware federal agents were trailing them the entire way. When the burglars spotted the surveillance near an oil shack, they panicked and fled back to Buffalo, abandoning the paintings. Agents recovered every piece undamaged. The FBI held off on prosecuting, choosing to build a larger case against the entire ring. More charges followed. DeCicco was tied to the theft of a Rembrandt from a Rochester museum, and Parnes to another burglary targeting a wealthy Buffalo banker. The trial began in January 1969, and Paul Parnes's testimony sealed the case. He had informed on his own brother, and none of the defendants had ever suspected him. Tuller made the trial memorable in her own way, showing up in flamboyant outfits and, according to one FBI agent, attempting to draw one of the defendants' wives into conversation during every recess. The judge eventually ordered her to stop approaching the defendants altogether. In the end, the burglars were convicted and sentenced to 5 years each, with one receiving 3. It was a modest legal outcome. But the real damage had already been done to the empire behind them. A boss who spent decades staying invisible from the FBI just got taken down in the papers by a 70-year-old widow who refused to let a stolen Picasso go quietly. While the Hanley case played out in court, a separate FBI investigation was closing in on Magaddino's own household. In November 1968, federal agents began investigating an illegal horse race betting operation tied to his son, Peter. A search warrant led them to Peter's home, where they recovered $473,000 in cash, money with no legitimate explanation. That discovery gave the FBI probable cause to search Stefano's house as well. When agents arrived, Magaddino collapsed, appearing to suffer a heart attack. He did have a documented history of heart trouble, but a doctor at the scene determined the episode was faked. He was arrested anyway. He never spent a day in jail. His lawyers repeatedly delayed the trial by citing his heart condition, dragging the case out until it effectively went nowhere. The real damage wasn't legal. It was personal. For years, Magaddino had told his underlings that money was tight, using it as justification for cutting back on payouts, including Christmas bonuses, to men who had worked for him loyally. The discovery of nearly $500,000 stashed in his son's home told a very different story. Retired FBI agent Donald Hartnett put it plainly afterward. People began to stop trusting him once they found all that money. 50 years of built loyalty doesn't survive a lie like that easily. By 1969, the Buffalo crime family was no longer the tightly controlled operation Magaddino had run since 1922. The Hanley heist had brought unwanted national attention. The cash found in his son's attic had shattered trust among his own men, and federal agents were watching his every move inside and outside his funeral home. The family split into dissident factions, groups of underlings no longer willing to answer to a boss who had allegedly lied to them for years. Leaders from within the organization met in Rochester at the end of 1968 to decide what came next. By early 1969, they made their decision. Magaddino was ousted as boss. He wasn't killed, he wasn't imprisoned. He was simply pushed aside by the very organization he had built and led for nearly 5 decades. What remained under his control was a diminished faction, made up mostly of his in-laws and the oldest members who had stayed loyal to him personally rather than to the organization. The man who survived a bomb, a grenade, an FBI wiretap operation, and a kidnapping plot against his own cousin was finally brought down by his own family deciding they'd had enough. Every external enemy had failed to remove him. In the end, all it took was his own people deciding the lie about the money was the one betrayal they wouldn't forgive. Stefano Magaddino spent his final years in a diminished version of the empire he'd once controlled, still respected by the men who remained loyal, but no longer the power he had been. His health, fragile for years, continued to decline. On July 19, 1974, Magaddino died of a heart attack at Mount St. Mary's Hospital in Lewiston, New York. He was 82. His funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, and he was laid to rest at St. Joseph's Cemetery on Pine Avenue in Niagara Falls, in the same soil where his empire had been built. He had led the Buffalo crime family longer than any boss in the history of the American Mafia, spanning Prohibition, 2 world wars, the rise of the FBI's organized crime division, and the collapse of his own family's trust in him. A power struggle within his old organization continued long after his death, as factions fought over what remained of his territory. The man who once avoided every headline, every courtroom, and every spotlight had, by the end, made national news anyway, not for a single dramatic act, but for how long he managed to avoid becoming one. What stays with me most about Magaddino's downfall is that none of the forces that finally beat him were the ones he spent his whole life preparing for. He built an empire designed to survive federal investigations, rival hits, and public exposure, and for nearly 50 years, it worked exactly as intended. What he never built a defense against was his own dishonesty catching up with him inside his own organization. Telling his men money was tight while $500,000 sat in his son's attic wasn't a strategic move. It was pure greed, and it's the one decision in this entire story that I think was genuinely avoidable. He didn't need to lie to men who had stayed loyal to him for decades. There's also something worth sitting with in the fact that his own cousin plotted to kill him, and he allegedly responded by having that same cousin kidnapped off a Manhattan street. That's not the behavior of a man who trusted anyone, even family, and I think that isolation is exactly why nobody stepped in to warn him when trust inside his own family started collapsing. Magaddino built the longest-running criminal reign in American mafia history by staying invisible to the outside world. In the end, it wasn't the outside world that ended it. It was the people closest to him deciding quietly that they'd had enough. 50 years at the top, and almost nobody outside the underworld ever knew his name while he ran it. That's the real story of Stefano Magaddino. If you enjoyed this one, hit like and subscribe for more stories from the world of organized crime. I'll see you in the next video.